Haha. All right, so Don, I'm going to have to save the video to the library's Zoom. So it will not be immediately up on our YouTube, but we will make sure we get that taken care of as soon as possible. Just so you're aware, slight change of pace this evening.
Okay.
All right, but with that, it's officially time to start this evening's program. Thank you to everybody that has joined us this evening. My name is Bethany Pearson. I am the program and volunteer coordinator for the Everett Rail Marshfield Public Library. I'm very thankful that you have joined us for yet another excellent Family History Talks program. This evening, we will be covering the Homestead case files. It was also a much longer title. Forgive me for not being able to remember the whole thing, but it was about homesteading files of Wisconsin and how to be able to utilize those and access those to be able to use for family history genealogy purposes. But I'm going to hand this over to Don Schnitzler, who will be the one that will be discussing it. And he is clearly much more aware of this particular topic. So, we're done listening to me. Couple of really quick housekeeping things. You can use the chat at the bottom of the screen at any time if you have any specific questions or concerns, if you're not hearing something, if something's really slow, you can't see something, can't hear something, use the chat to go ahead and use that. And then there is also a Q&A, which is also found at the bottom of your screen. And you can use the Q&A function in order to ask any questions specifically related to this program. And those questions will be I will relate those questions to Don at the end of the program, and we will answer those questions as much as we can at that point in time. Other than that, I will be muting and turning off my camera, but I will be here, so I will be assisting with anything that is needed, so don't hesitate to ask us any questions. But I think I will stop at this time and hand the reins over to Don.
All right. Thank you very much, Bethany. To be honest, I don't remember how the program was advertised either, the exact title. But tonight what we're going to talk about is the Homestead Act a little bit and the records that were created by people who applied for homesteads and what they provide as far as information for people doing family history. And to be honest, when it comes to the records that are available through the Homestead Act, or the land entry records as they're called, there's some tremendous pieces of information in those files that really add unique stories to the stories about your ancestors. And so we'll talk a little bit about what you might find and how you go about finding them as we go through tonight's discussion. Maybe. All right. When you think about Wisconsin in 1862, especially in this area, Marshfield hasn't even been thought of yet. And yet, when the Homestead Act was approved or signed by President Lincoln in May of 1862, it was being reported in the Central Wisconsin newspapers within a couple weeks. You look on the right, the newspaper column appeared in the Wood County Reporter. That's a newspaper from Wisconsin Rapids, or Grand Rapids at the time. And they had a several-inch article talking about the Homestead Bill. And then a week or two later, in the Wisconsin Pinery, which was a Stevens Point newspaper, you saw another newspaper article about the Homestead Act. It was big news. It was something that people had wanted to see done, and it couldn't be accomplished until after the South seceded from the Union. It allowed their votes to go through and pass the Homestead Act. So there's a lot of things that go into effect with the Homestead Act, the Homestead Bill, but the big part of this is that people wanted to have access to some of the public domain. We're going to talk a little bit about some definitions here in a minute, but when it comes to this Homesteading Act, what it really did is it provided free land for hundreds of thousands of families. And when it comes to where this was promoted, it wasn't just in the United States. It was one of the reasons that so many immigrants came from outside of the United States to the US in that time period. It was an attraction, a draw for people from Europe who were coming to the United States with the hope of getting a good foundation. It was really important for the United States as far as the manifest destiny of incorporating all the 48 contiguous states and having that not wilderness or not wildland, but actually places where towns and villages and businesses were thriving. So the free land was an incentive for people to move from the East Coast to the West Coast and in between. One of the things about the Homestead Act is a little bit about knowing how the property came about being. And there's a difference between the states on the east side of the country versus the states on the west side. So if you look at this map, there's a map here that shows the original 13 colonies in that kind of darker gray shaded area. It's the original 13 colonies plus a couple other states. And then to the west of that, you can start seeing the territories that made up the rest of the United States. The first federal property that was owned by the US government was actually the Northwest Territory. And that was made up of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. And that land originally belonged to the 13 colonies. But after the American Revolution and the country gained its independence, the original 13 colonies gave that property to the federal government to help pay the bills for the costs of the war. And the original intention was to sell the land to generate revenue for the government. But there was always discussion about, well, what if we were to donate this land or give this land so people would settle the territory? What would be the advantages of doing that? And as the United States acquired more and more land, and you can see by 50 years, 1853, 1853 was the last acquisition of the 48 states. They had all this land and they needed to find a purpose for it. First, they were selling it, then they were donating it, but eventually they came up with this Homestead Act, and there were other acts before that that the Homestead Act actually built on. And the Homestead Act of 1862 was actually tweaked a number of times during its existence. But they wanted to do something with this land, and in the end, they decided to give it to people to encourage westward expansion. Now, while they were doing this to promote westward expansion, there was also a lot of issues that came up during the process where the land was going to other than just the American citizens or people who were naturalized citizens that were going to settle on 160 acres of land. There were some problems, but they worked them out the best they could, and it was a very important act for the United States. Another map of the United States, and this again is really trying to demonstrate the difference between the state land states and what's referred to as the public land states, federal land states. The 13 original colonies plus the states of Kentucky, Maine, Tennessee, Texas, Vermont, and West Virginia are what's referred to as the state land states. And what that means is that they controlled what happened to their lands. They could sell their lands to individuals, they could have land grants, they could do homesteading. Texas, for example, is a homestead state, but the homestead is actually run through the Texas government. So if you're looking for records for homesteaders in Texas, you have to contact the office in Austin, Texas to get those records. The blue states are what's referred to as the public land states or the federal land states. And that is the land that was homesteaded through the US government. And so the files that we're talking about tonight are actually the records that are concerning those 30 states that make up the public land states. Now, I've put these arrows up here because one of the things that's important about the Homestead Act is that if you're looking at your family history, one of the things to keep in mind is if you see a sudden move from one area to another after 1862, that the explanation for it may have to do with the fact that someone in the family was a homesteader. In my case, my great-great-grandparents migrated from Warren County, New York to Marathon County in 1872 and 3. And then about 25, 30 years later, a couple of their children actually emigrated or migrated to Montana to homestead land there. So sometimes when you're seeing these big jumps from one state to another state, the explanation is homesteading. And at the same time, while I can prove the importance of homesteading and the migration of my ancestors across the northern part of the United States, just as many people who homesteaded made short jumps. People in Wisconsin might have homesteaded in Minnesota. People in Iowa might have homesteaded in Nebraska. Minnesota was good for going to the Dakota Territory. So a lot of times the homesteading was short migrations rather than big migrations. But in either case, homesteading is one of the incentives that sometimes cause our families to move from one location to another. I also like to share this this slide because I think it's important to realize how many successful homestead claims were made over the course of the Homestead Act being in effect. And this is one of the longest acting federal acts that were passed by the government. It was passed in 1862, went into effect January 1st, 1863, and wasn't repealed until 1976. And even when it was repealed in 1976, there was a extension for homesteading in Alaska that lasted until 1986. So this is a really long-term bill. President Kennedy said it was one of the most impactful bills on the face of the United States, the appearance of the United States. So it's an important bill. One of the things I like about this chart, though, is that it shows you by state the differences as far as the number of homesteads, successful homesteads per state. You can see that Montana has the most homesteading, the successful homesteads, and that brings it up to 151,600 parcels or claims for homesteading. Some of the states that have the lowest number, Indiana, for example, at 30, Illinois at 74, relatively few. And the reason for that is because that land was already claimed or sold by the time the Homestead Act went into effect. And then you can see Wisconsin, second from the top, at 29,246 successful homestead claims. Not the top number, but it's a relatively good or high number for successful homestead claims. Actually, when they talk about successful claims, they say that Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and North Dakota and South Dakota make up about 20% of all the homestead claims that were done over the course of the Homestead Act being in effect. So what does it mean to Wisconsin, to central Wisconsin, and to the people that we know around here and who might be a descendant of a homesteader? First off, in Wood counties, and I'll start with Wood County because of Marshfield. Marshfield or Wood County has the lowest number of homesteaders by comparison to the three counties in this area. Wood County had 283 homesteaders, Clark County 757, and Marathon County 832. And if you look at that, one of the reasons you can explain this is that the southern part of Wood County and along the river on the eastern part of Wood County was all pretty well settled early on. And so there was less available land. And then when the railroad came through, as an incentive to the railroad, the federal government gave land grants to the railroad to encourage the building of the railroad to Ashland. And so some of the land from Wood County and Clark and Marathon was actually included in the land grants to the railroads. But when it push comes to shove, in Wood County, there was less land available when homesteading began, and that's why the number is lower. Clark County and Marathon County, again, very respectable numbers for the number of homesteaders. And again, when you look at that, the homesteading was from the county line on the west side over to the east side of Marathon County. And more of the homesteading was done on the west as the railroad went through, and then in the land between the railroad and, say, over towards Wausau. So again, it depended on what land was available, what land was settled first, and so homesteaders could come to that area. Now, one of the other things that I like to show here is that when we think about homesteading, a lot of times we think because 1862 is when the law was passed, that all the homesteading was done early on in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you can look at this graph and see that really that isn't true. Most of the homesteading was done after 1900. And so that's where you see the peak of the bell curve, basically, as far as the number of homesteads completed. But then you see that it takes a sudden drop off in the 1930s. And what happened is in 1930, FDR passed another law that, or another act, or the Congress passed an act, and President Roosevelt signed it, that severely restricted the lands in the West. It was a grazing act, so they kept the land for grazing cattle, and that severely impacted the amount of land that was available for homesteading. So you see that sudden drop off in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and the early 70s. It doesn't even get on the list there. But again, just because the act was passed in 1862 doesn't mean that all of the homesteading was done early on. Oops. So what did the Homestead Act do? Well, the Congress passed the act in May of 1862, and on May 20th, Abraham Lincoln signed it. And though it was signed in 1862, it didn't become effective until January 1st, 1863. And what the act did was it provided 160 acres of land free of charge to citizens of the United States who wanted to claim the land and meet some provisions. So first off, there was this 160 acres of land that was promised to people free. In order to get that land, though, you had to go through an application process. You selected the land, and then you had to pay fees. And while it says that you were provided 160 acres of land, it really depends on when the application was made. Early applications were probably for 160 acres of land, but not all of them were. I have an example of application that was made in Marathon County in 1878. It was for just 40 acres of land. And so it depends on where and what was available. First off, how much land you received. And then the 160 acres, when the government set that number, they had it in their mind what that needed to be. And they had 40 acres for the house, the barn, 40 acres for hay or crops that could be used to feed the cattle, 40 acres for pasture land, and then 40 acres for basically set aside for some type of cash crop that the farmer could sell. What the second requirement of the Homestead Act, though, was that a person was given this land provided. And so in order to provide or to really gain the title to the land, you had to meet certain provisions of that property. First one was that you had to build a home on the land, and then you had to cultivate the land, and you had to maintain residency for 5 years. Now, over the course of the Homestead Act, those requirements changed slightly. Sometimes a person could receive the title of the land after a year if they paid $1.25 per acre, or if they had been in the service, they could receive the title to the land. What they would do is they take the 5-year requirement and subtract the time that they served active duty during the Civil War. And so there was some fluctuation on this maintained residency for 5 years. You will see some of the Homestead Acts that show you that they were on the property for 2 or 3 years, and others that show that they were on the property for 6, 7, 8 or more years. but they were still maintaining their residency. Then the last thing that was included with this is that after you'd been on the property for the 5 years, for example, you had to submit proof and seek approval for the title or the patent of for the land from the government. And so when you look at the Homestead Act, it's kind of a three-step process: an application, meeting those provisions, and then submitting a request for the actual title to the property. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that there were approximately 4 million applications for homestead lands. But to prove the point that this is not an easy task for people, only about 1.6 million actually earned the title to the land. For some people, it was they didn't have the tools, couldn't raise the money to even get the application going, or once the application was made to meet the requirements to improve the land. And so there was a number of reasons why homesteads failed, and you can see there were more failures than there were successes. Now, as far as the eligibility goes, when it comes to being eligible for a homestead claim, when the rules were first passed, it said that any person who is the head of a household, they had to be 21 years of age, and they had to be a citizen of the United States, or would have had to file their declaration of intent to become a citizen. And then if you think about when this was passed in 1862 during the Civil War. The last caveat prevented people who were Confederate soldiers from applying for homesteads, and so never borne arms against the United States. So now, during the first couple years of the Homestead Act being active, Confederate soldiers weren't allowed to require the property. After 1867, I think it was, if they swore allegiance to the United States, then they could. And in December 25th, 1868, I think it was, there was the Christmas pardon where President Johnson pardoned all the Confederate soldiers who had previously bore arms against the United States. And so after that time, they were eligible also for the homestead claims. Now, what's important to genealogists are these papers that are generated. And we all know that the government likes to collect papers. I mean, you can't do anything without generating some type of paper, signatures for anything. And so when the homestead process was being done, there were papers that were generated, and those papers were kept. So if you divide this up into a three-part process, the homestead application being the first process, there was an application where you went in and you said that this is the piece of property you want. There was an affidavit that the entryman, the person who was going to enter the homestead, had to swear to. And if you remember those provisions, you had to be 21 years of age, the head of a household, never bore arms against the United States, and a citizen of the United States. So you had to sign an affidavit to that effect. And then you had to pay fees. Now, while we talk about the homestead being free land, there were costs involved. And the application process cost about $10. And then there was a couple dollars that were included for the register and the receiver, who were the people that worked in the land office. Register kept track of all the different pieces of property that were being homesteaded, and the receiver received the cash payments for it and documented the dollars for the government. And then the last one was the receipt, and the receiver gave a receipt to the applicant when he filed for his homestead application. We talked a little bit about the provisions. We'll talk about that some more. But during that next part, the person is actually living on the land and meeting the provisions of clearing the property, building a house, building a barn, setting up crops. And then when that 5-year period is over, the homestead proof is submitted. And so what they had to do for the homestead was they had to provide testimony themselves. The land entryman or the claimant of the property would basically fill out an affidavit and say, this is what I did and what I didn't do. And then they had to bring in 2 disinterested or non-interested parties to come in and testify saying that, yes, this is what the claimant did for this property, and he should be able to make claim on this homestead, and the patent should be awarded to him. Not to do it too quickly, what happened was you had those two witnesses come in and you had the claimant come in, but before they could provide that proof of making the claim, it was published in a local newspaper saying that the resident A, B, and C were going to be here at the courthouse this day with the intent to make claim to their land. If anyone had reasons why they shouldn't be receiving that land, they could come to the courthouse and argue against it. Once all the proof was submitted, then it was reviewed and sent to the Bureau of Land Management, who actually, or the General Land Office, who actually submitted or returned a patent to the property. And again, before that was done, there was a receipt for the last payment. The initial payment was $10 or about $10, and the last payment was about $6. So for about $18, a person could receive this 160 acres of free land. And if you think about the value of $18, for example, from 1862 to present time, they were actually paying out like between $350 and $450, depending on what year they made this claim for this free land. And in some cases, that small amount of money actually restricted the people who could apply for homesteads and complete a homestead. Now, one of the things about the homestead papers, in addition to those things that I just mentioned, there are other papers that you can find in these records sometimes. Naturalization papers, because an individual had to be a citizen of the United States or must have declared intent to become a citizen. Sometimes you will find those papers in the land entry files, the homestead case files. If they were claiming credit for the time they were in the Union Army, there may be copies of discharge papers there. And if someone, one of the applicants or land entrymen passed away, a lot of times there's proof of the death of that individual. And then there's newspaper clippings and sometimes marriage or death certificates. Sometimes there's some surprises in the materials that you receive back. I'll show you a couple examples. So the National Archives has a really nice example of what the homestead application and land entry file looks like, and they use Charles Ingalls, Little House on the Prairie Ingalls fame. And anyway, what you have here is Charles Ingalls' application for a homestead in the Dakota Territories in 1880. And you see it says that I'm Charles Ingalls, that he lives in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory. It gives a legal description for the property that he is applying for. And in this case, it was 1/2 northeast half quarter, section 3, township 110, range 5 and 6 in the Dakota Territory. So that legal description is something that's very important in all homestead applications, because when they first started to provide homesteads to the citizens, it was based not on their names, but on the location of the property. And so all the original records for homestead applications, whether they were successfully completed or unsuccessful, are recorded first by the section, the township, and the range, the legal description of the property. Now, each one of these applications specifically says how many acres it is. And this one was 154.29 acres. I have to think if I actually saw one that was an even 160 acres. They're always 160 acres or less when the first applications were made. The earlier applications were made at different points and at different places. The number of acres, the total numbers of acres that a homesteader was allowed to apply for actually increased. So there might be some for 320
or 640 acres too. But right now, most of the applications are going to be under 160 acres, those early ones, and they may not be exactly 160 acres. You'll see the odd numbers. One of the things that the Homestead application or the Homestead case files are good for are providing multiple opportunities to find the signatures of your ancestors, because the homesteader was required more than once to sign these forms. And so as you're going through homestead applications or homestead records, quite often you'll find multiple copies of the signed documents. The other part of the homestead application process was the affidavit. And when you look at this affidavit, again, it says, I, Charles Ingle, Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, swear that I am the head of a family consisting of my wife and 4 children and a citizen of the United States of America. Again, it goes back to those provisions that this land was made available to people who were the head of a household, 21 years of age, and a citizen of the United States. So you get that kind of information on the affidavit. And again, you look down at the bottom, you can see that it's got a signature by the entryman, Charles Ingalls here. And then the last piece of information in the application is you have to pay for that application. And in this case, Mr. Ingalls paid $13.86 for the 159 acres as his application amount. And so you can see how much he paid. You can see the receiver's name on it. And the receiver gives a receipt so that the homestead, the entryman, the homesteader, can actually enter the property and start the process of proving up his claim. Now, when it comes to the homestead proof, homesteading required a lot of work. And so depending on what part of the country was homesteaded, you get different obstacles that you have to overcome. In central Wisconsin and northern Wisconsin, after the lumbermen came through and people were homesteading this land, you had lots of pine stumps to clear. And this is a picture of a family clearing the stumps from their farmland sometime in the early 1900s. But in Wisconsin, we had pine stumps. In Nebraska, they had the prairie grasses, and that was a relatively thick, hard to work soil. So every place had their own little set of obstacles that the homesteaders had to overcome. But they did. And once they spent that time on the property, the 5 years was up. Then they had to provide testimony to the General Land Office. And so again, they were asked a series of questions. And this one, question 1 was, what is your name? Written in full and correctly spelled, your age and post office address. And here Mr. Ingalls answers, my name is Charles P. Ingalls, 50 years of age, living in DeSmet County, Kingsbury County, Dakota. And then there's another question. Question 2, are you a native? Yes. In his case, he was native born citizen. And one of the things that I've seen in a lot of these homestead applications and homestead files is they pay very close attention to citizenship because it's one of the requirements for completing a homestead. And I'll show you a couple examples in a second. When was your house built on the land, and when did you establish actual residence therein? As part of the provisions for homesteading, once a piece of property was assigned or applied for, they had 6 months to move on to the property. And so they always ask that question, when was your house built and when did you establish actual residence? And so Mr. Ingalls answers, in May of 1880, they built a frame house, 14 by 20, addition 12 by 16, 1 story. They have a good well and a pump. They've built a frame barn, hip roof, 16 by 20, and then they have 60 acres bearing apple trees, plum trees, small fruit trees in abundance, approximately 6,000 acres. Mr. Ingalls was a busy worker. One of the things that's interesting here is that when you look at this, they don't say how big the house is. Now, I have no doubt that Mr. Ingalls completely built a 14 by 20 foot or a 12 by 16 foot buildings. When they talk about some of the fraud that was going on with some of the early homesteads, is they would pull a house onto the property, and so they could say that they saw it there, or they were building a much smaller thing, 14 inches by 20 inches. And that was one of the ways that there was fraud going on. Because early on, there wasn't someone that could watch these things all real close, some things got away. It seems like there's always someone trying to take advantage of things. But the Homestead Act still did good things for more people than not. Fourth question was, of whom does your family consist, and have you or your family resided continuously on this land since first establishing residence there? And so Mr. Ingalls here answers that his wife and 4 children is the size of the family, and I have except as answered in the next question. And it's really important that people maintain their residencies here, so they always explain that time when they were away very much. So they asked the question about when were you absent, and Mr. Ingalls answers, I was absent for about 3 months in the winter of 1881 and 1882, and 3 months for the winter of 82 and 83, so that the children could go to school, and since which time the residence has been continuous. You'll see lots of examples when you look at these homestead records talking about families not being on the property for the full year. I have several examples from Marathon County where the homesteaders worked as loggers, and they were gone to the logging camps, and they took their families with them in the winter to work in the woods. And so you'll see different answers like that and get to know a little bit more about what the family was doing that you wouldn't find in the paper, you wouldn't find in your family records probably, unless you're lucky enough to have someone who kept a diary and talked about all these things. Then they ask about cultivating the land, and they wanted to, again, part of proving the land was improving the land and actually raising crops on it. And here Mr. Ingalls said he has 60 acres and raised crops. Now, there was no specific requirement about how much land had to be cultivated. And so you may see things where they talk about 3, 4, 5 acres, and others where they talk about 60, 70, 80 acres. And then they ask about minerals. And again, here I think what they're looking for is just to prove that the land doesn't have any economic value that would prevent them from giving the land patent to someone. So they're asking about minerals and coal, saline minerals and things, and only value is for agricultural purposes. And have you ever made entry on any other homestead? Having made entry on another homestead does not disqualify someone from applying for a second homestead or even a third. What they have to watch is the number of acres that they've applied for. Louis Rivers, who is the first white settler in Marshfield in the 1870s, actually went to Nebraska and homesteaded 2 times. The 2 homesteads, though, were more than 320 acres. And so the government made him pay $1.25 for the 5 or 6 acres that were over 320 acres. And then the question about, have you sold, conveyed, mortgaged any portion of this land? And again, the intent here is to make sure that they don't have someone coming in, claiming land, and then selling it to someone else right away, rather than, so it wouldn't be a legitimate homestead, actually, is what they're getting at. And in this case, Mr. Ingalls just said no, no, no. And he was trying to say no, he didn't sell it, no, he didn't convey it, and no, he didn't mortgage it. Now, that was the first set of forms that was completed specifically by the claimant. And then they bring in 2 witnesses and ask similar, if not almost identical questions. So what is your occupation? That's specific to the individual. And then how do you know the individual who's applying for the homestead? And then they go through and ask the questions that relate to whether or not the applicant is qualified, when they established their homestead, who was living on the homestead, and whether or not that residence was continuous. And if it wasn't continuous, where were they and how long? So they asked those same kind of questions to reinforce what the claimant had said. And it goes right down to the same thing about the minerals on the property and whether or not they had mortgaged or sold or contracted to sell any of the property. After they've gone through that process at the local land office, then they getting that part ready, they have to make this legal notice in the newspaper. And so there's this intent to make the final proof that's actually published for 6 weeks in the local newspaper, and they are telling them who are going to be the witnesses. And so in this case, you've got Charles Ingalls up here, and you can see there's a Martin, or Masters, a Boast, a Perry, and a Wilder here. And while the individuals are not supposed to be directly related to the homesteaders, not have an interest, you can probably will remember that Laura Ingalls, Mr. Ingalls' daughter, married a Wilder, and this would have been her father-in-law. And when you get to small communities, everybody was knew each other and were related. So it's hard to meet that claim about disinterested parties. And so there's lots of times where you'll see, looking at these, where you'll see direct relatives or people you could see that there was a relationship to the entryman. One of the things that I do kind of like about this is it gives you a chance to see what was actually published in the papers and what at the time was considered the local paper. So here you have the public notice that appeared in the local paper, and you can see that on here it gives a specific name of the paper that was considered the local paper at the time. So here Mr. Ingalls' his claim is being published in the Kingsbury County News. So if you're going to be looking for other local stories, you might want to track down that newspaper and see what you can find reported in there for information. And there's a close-up of it. And again, it basically says exactly what was on the other form, that the date is going to be, the date is set up for May 7th. And the people who are going to be witnesses for Mr. Ingalls are John Owen, Martin, George Masters, and Royal Wilder. And then the other names are there for other people who are also having their hearings that same day. After that's done, the receiver basically collects another small fee. It could be up to $6. And you can see here it's $3.86, which you add that to the original $13, it brings it to just shy of $18. And the register then takes all of the information and kind of puts it in chronological order, answers the questions, and this all gets packed up and sent to the General Land Office, Bureau of Land Management, for their review. And then if it's approved, the patent, the piece of paper that actually transfers ownership of the land from the government to the individual, is sent to the homesteader. Now, one of the things about these patents is when the land patent was awarded, the original was given to the homesteader and a copy was kept at the Bureau of Land Management. It is not part of the actual homestead case file. We can see the patent for all the successful homesteaders through the Bureau of Land Management. And I think I'll show you that next. No, I won't. I'll show it to you in a minute. But it's possible to get to these records and still see them if you don't have access to the original that the family would have been given. And these papers basically tell you where the property was. And if you look here, there's a legal description right here of the property. You've got the number for the certificate and for the application that was used by the original applicant. In this case, Robert Spencer died the 2 years after he filed for the homestead, and his wife, Mary Spencer, the widow of Robert Spencer, is actually completing the homestead application. But you can get that nice description. And in the early years when these were done, the president actually signed these forms. So if you have an original, you might have an original signature of a president. But at a certain point, the president stopped signing them and they had secretaries signing them for them. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about my family, but my family was a Marathon County homestead family. And I already mentioned that it was the reason that Robert Spencer came from New York to central Wisconsin in 1872. But this is Robert and Mary Wells Spencer's family. Robert was born in Ireland, Mary was born in Canada, and they had 12 children. Of the 12 children, one of them didn't survive. He died when he was 4 or 5 years old. And the other children grew up in New York. They were all born in New York and grew up there. But when you look at the family as far as who were homesteaders, the ones here in orange are all people who were connected with homesteading in the 1870s. Actually, the 1870s and even up until the early 1910 time frame. So we have Robert and Mary Spencer. When they came to Wisconsin in Robert came in 1872, Mary came in 1873. And as far as I can tell, Robert either came by himself or with his son-in-law. And then Mary came with their children, and the oldest son, Robert Wallace, probably was the one who was kind of responsible for helping to move the whole family here. Now, Dora's got a little different look because she was here, and after her father died, her brother-in-law's brother came from New York, married her, and took her back to New York. And so she lived the rest of her life back in New York. But you can see there's in one family, there's lots of connections to homesteading. And maybe I should mention this now. One of the things about homesteading, there's 1.6 million successful homestead claims. And they have estimated that of the United States citizens, there are 93 million descendants of homesteaders. So this isn't something that just affects a small number of people. It is, that's a big impact on lots of people in the United States today. So again, one of the things that was important when I found this homestead file for my great-great-grandfather was we didn't know when he came to Wisconsin. And we know from this that he was here November 19th, 1872 to actually make the application for the land in Marathon County. And he says at that time that he was a resident of Marathon County. So I don't know how long he'd been here, but he was already in Wisconsin before he filed the application. And it goes through and you can see I, Robert Spencer of Marathon County, a citizen of the United States, that he had served in Company I, the 5th New York Cavalry, and that he mustered into service November 1863 and was honorably discharged July 1865. Now this is important for him because when he applied for this homestead, he was actually applying for it with the military service, and so he was going to be able to claim just about 2 years less time for that requirement to be on the property for 5 years. And again, the last thing is that this is a good place to find Robert's signature. There was also included with this actually a copy of his discharge papers from the Civil War. And so we go through that and you get that he was again Company I, 5th New York Cavalry. that he enlisted December 22nd, 1863. He was discharged 19 July, 1865, and that his birthplace was Ireland. The one thing that's interesting on this form is that it says his age is 24, and you can see that right here. In actuality, he was 44 years old and the father of 9 kids already when he went into the service. Asked what the occupation was, and he says he's enrolled as a farmer. And then again, there was someone who made a copy of this form, said they had certified all the information and that it was a true copy thereof. But this was a mistake that was not on the original discharge papers. Then, unfortunately, my great-great-grandfather passed away shortly after arriving in Wisconsin, a couple of years after arriving in Wisconsin. And he'd already made the homestead application. He was proving the land and passed away. And so there had to be proof of that included in his homestead proofing process. And so we have his wife here saying that she is the widow of Robert Spencer, that he died on the 3rd of May, 1874, and then he resides in the Sid homestead. He resided in the Sid homestead and has, since the death of her husband, she had, and then cultivated it to the best of her ability. And they never take the one person's word; they always have someone substantiating it. And then here you see that it says, and that Sid Robert Spencer died on or about the 3rd day of May, 1874, and they were present when he died and at his funeral. And that Sid Robert Spencer was residing on the homestead with his family when he died. So they're going through and they're talking about or verifying the facts that are needed to help prove the claim. Again, there were some other neighbors that had to file proof here. And what we have is that said Robert Spencer moved onto the homestead in the spring of 1873 in the month of April. One of the things that's unique about their particular piece of property is when Robert Spencer homesteaded the property, they lived in Unity. They lived just north of County Trunk P, where it intersects with Highway 13 going north. And right across the road was the railroad property, the railroad line going through. And so they had a really nice piece of property that they acquired as part of this homestead process. But it goes through and talks about when they moved in here. And so we know by the application date that Robert moved to central Wisconsin in November 1872. And we know that his wife arrived in the spring of 1873 to settle on the property in April. And that is just about the time when the Central Wisconsin Central Railroad made it to well, they were probably up at Colby by April. And so they had direct access to this property by railroad. So they didn't have to worry about going through woods with oxen or anything else. And then again, here we have the same thing, kind of talking about when the family moved onto the property. This witness said that Robert Spencer commenced work on his homestead sometime in the summer of 1872 in clearing and building a house in which his family would live. I think it's interesting that he might have been working on the property before he filed the application, or maybe that's a mistake. I don't know, because technically they had to apply for the property before they moved onto it. And then again, the evidence of 2 witnesses. In this case, they had Edward and Addie Bean, and that they said that Mary was the head of the household, consisting of 3 members, and that was the 3 youngest children, Carrie, William, and Eliza, and that they made settlement on the land the 1st day of April, 1873, and there's a house built on it. It has a barn. They've cleared 5 acres and set out about 50 fruit trees, and the house is a comfortable one in which to live. Now, the one thing about these 2 people that I should mention, Ed and Addie Bean, again, is non-interested parties. Addie is actually Mary Spencer's daughter, and Ed is her son-in-law. And so, again, it was very common to find that when you look at the witnesses to see relationships between the individuals providing that information, and the originally entryman or the person claiming the land. You can also find other content, and this one I think is kind of interesting. This is actually a homestead application for another member of the Spencer family. This is the son-in-law who may have come with Robert Spencer from New York to Marathon County in 1872. He's filing for a homestead in 1873. So he arrived here, probably helped his father-in-law with setting up and building the building that was on their property, and then claimed land himself. And what I think is interesting about this is a story that you would get lost after 115 years since the guy passed away. But he talks about Eugene Sweet being duly sworn, that the reason why he did not establish his residence on land within 6 months after making entry is as follows. Sometime in the summer of 1873, he commenced clearing land as he supposed his said homestead land, and had made considerable clearing, and was ready in December to haul lumber for the purpose of building a house, when he ascertained that by mistake he had commenced improvements on the wrong property. And so he cleared land on somebody else's property, and he basically had to start over with building a house for his own property. But that's a story that, one of the things about family history is you want the stories to add color to your family history, and this is a perfect example of something that is a nice story to have. And the only place you'd find it is probably in these records. Uncle Eugene and Aunt Mary Jane died in 1917. They died a week apart, so that's 105 years ago. There's nobody left to tell that story, but you can find it here in these records. I also mentioned that Louis Rivers, this is actually Louis Rivers' signature here. Louis Rivers was from Marshfield. In 1885, he takes off and goes to Nebraska, and he homesteads land. And he actually homesteaded land twice. And in this affidavit, what is interesting is he was getting harassed, or not harassed, but made to prove that he was a citizen. So he said that he made his declaration to become a citizen when he was 21 years of age, and that he is now 62 years of age. And so he thought that he should be naturalized. And then he goes on and says he is informed and believes that he is entitled to be finally naturalized after, during all the time he held the said homestead entry, and that since making his declaration to become a citizen of the United States, he has always been faithful and law-abiding citizen and attached to the principles of the Constitution of the United States. And then written in on this, I'm going to see if I can back up here. Written in on here, you can see that typed separately is the date 1893. The paperwork here was actually submitted in 1894, but here's the citizenship papers that were in his next homestead case file. And they had to ask for him again because he didn't submit them with the application. But you can see that on the 17th of October, 1893, Mr. Rivers actually was given a certificate of citizenship in the state of Nebraska. So again, you never know quite what you will find in these. There's certain things that you will find, the application process, the proofing, the things that people did to prove the claim. But there could be other documents or stories that will add to your family history that you wouldn't have had when you started. So it's always a good set of records to look at. Now, as far as obtaining homestead case files and land entry case files, all the originals are in the National Archives. But over the last 4 or 5 years, they have been, well, since 2013, probably started in 2011. So it's actually over the last 10 years. They have been digitizing these records. And so you can actually get some of these records online now. Unfortunately for Wisconsin, that's not true. But there are some that are available online, and then other ones have to be ordered from the National Archives. If you are going to apply for records, one of the things to keep in mind is that you have to have the legal description of the property if there's not an index to the homestead. And with records that are available through the Bureau of Land Management, though, that if a case was successful, you're usually pretty easy to get the description of the property and actually obtain the homestead records itself. So the first thing I think you should do is, if you're looking for family history, specifically homestead records for your family, you want to go to this website. It's www.generallandofficerecords, GLO records, Bureau of Land Management, BLM.gov. And it will take you to this site. It'll take you to this site in a minute. And what it does is that site contains records for patents. What were the transfer of land from the government to an individual or to somebody. And so what you have here is the General Land Office records that are online. 29% of them are properties that were sold. 28% of them are homestead grants. 22% are grants to the states, 12% grant to the railroads, military bounty land 7%, and then private land claims 2%. For our purposes, when it comes to looking at the actual land entry file records, you only want to apply for them if you are looking at a homestead. If you're looking at a cash or credit sale, what you get is a sales receipt. You want the homestead grant records for land entry file records. So you want to look at those specifically and be sure that you're looking at a homestead grant. And I'll show you what you're going to look for. This is the Bureau of Land Management website. When you first get started, it's a really easy, friendly user-friendly website. But if you're just getting started, the reference center here has lots of information in it that can help you make the searches easier. So I'd suggest starting there just to get a feel for what everything is on the site. Then after you do, I guess I'm going to show you what that is. You can see all the different menu items here that you can look at. And they're just nice brief descriptions to help you through your search process. After you've gone through that and you want to start doing searching, you just go over to the search documents. You click on that button and it will bring up this screen. And it's a matter of putting in the information that you want to look for. So I know my Robert Spencer was in Wisconsin, that he homesteaded and that he was successful. If I didn't know that though, and I didn't know the location, what I would do is I would put Wisconsin, because I know it was Wisconsin, and then I would put his first and last name. Now, one thing about this site is it's very dependent on spelling. So if you have an unusual name that might be spelled different ways, you might want to leave things blank or play with the spelling, do alternate spellings if something doesn't turn up. In my case here, though, I just wanted to use this as an example. I know that they were in Wisconsin and in Marathon County. I could have put Marathon County down, but sometimes less is more. And so you could do a search for Robert Spencer in Wisconsin and get a list of them, or you could do a search for just Spencer and get a bigger list. So it's one of those things that as you're searching with these, it's probably best to play with it a little bit to see what the results are. So we put the location in, the name Robert Spencer, and we hit for search patents, and it brings up a list. And you can see that Robert Spencer shows up in a number of different places here. And we know the county, so I can just go over to this right-hand column and see that there's only 2 listings in Marathon County, both for the same land patent, Robert and Mary Spencer. You click on the little highlighted hyperlink here, and it will bring you up to the information on their particular piece of property. So what you have here is you have Robert and Mary Spencer. Those are the names that are going to be on the land patent. That the land was obtained from the Wausau office. that the answer to the mineral reservations, no, and US reservations, no. The authority here is important though, because you want to make sure that if you're looking at these records, that if you find your family name on here, that it says Homestead Entry Original, because those are the ones that have the land entry case files that are important for helping us with family history. The receipts don't do anything. It's nice to see them or nice to know that they have the property, but you don't want to spend $50 to get just a receipt for a non-homestead land transfer. And so again, here, then there's some descriptions. There's the certificate number, there's the application number, the total number of acres, and whether it was determined by meets and bounds. And when it comes to the homestead, the land was surveyed, and it was all done by the rectangular system for the property. By clicking on the print friendly view, it will bring up a copy that you can print and not use as much ink, has the same information on it, slightly different format, but it also includes the legal description of the property here. And then if we go back to that previous slide, there's a scroll bar here on the side that if you scroll way down to it, it will bring up a map. And here's that legal description for the property. You click one of those, you just put a check mark in one of those and hit return. It will bring up a map of Marathon County, Wisconsin. You can see here's the Marathon County border, town of Spencer, town of Unity. And in this quarter section here is where the Spencer farm was. Now they had actually the 150 acres were the top part of that right there. Was their property. It doesn't pinpoint the exact location, but it comes close enough that a person could go and find the property if they wanted to. Other things that are important on this particular website is if there was a patent given, and these people all have, this site has all the patents for the property transfers. You can find a copy of the original patent that was given to the land entryman by clicking on that link where it says patent image. And you can, here's the image that comes up, and you can save it to your computer, you can print it, or you can copy it and manipulate it any way you want. And this again is the entire document for the land patent that would have been given to my great-great-grandmother when she proved her claim in 1878. And we already mentioned that he's saving and stuff. The other thing that shows up on this site that I think is kind of interesting is the related documents. You can click on this link here and it will bring up related documents. And what that does is it shows you who all the neighbors were. And so you have Edmund Creed, Fritz Darling, people that were neighbors to the Spencer family that had adjoining property to their property. And so you can find out who some of the other people were in the area. You can see when they moved into the area as opposed to when your family, not when they moved in, when they proved their claim. So here's Edmund Creed, for example. He completed his homestead claim in 1874, Fritz Darling in 1873, and then my great-great-grandmother down here in 1878. Now these two dates, 1860 and 1859, are either cash sales or bounty land sales because they're before 1862. They're not going to be homestead records. So they acquired their property in some other way, and you can actually go in and look at their information and find out how the land was transferred from the government to them, just out of curiosity. One last thing I wanted to kind of point out on this page is these icons over here, are hyperlinks over here. If you click on one of those, it will bring you to the surveys. And the original surveys for Marathon County were done in 1853. And you can actually see an image of what those look like. So you click on the original survey, it brings up a description of the property, and you click on plat image, and it will bring up this, and you click on the plat image again, and it brings up the actual map that was made in 1853 for this section of Marathon County. Oops, and there, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. My family's up in that upper left-hand corner here. If I go back, oops, not there, here. So we're looking right in here for that property. And you see that these three sections are the property that Robert Spencer homesteaded in 1872. So you're in section 6, and then you can have the legal description to the property, so you can track down the records. Now, I mentioned that we can find the patent on this site. That's all you can find on there is the patent or the information for the land that someone homesteaded or somehow acquired from the government. The records that are available at the National Archives are being digitized. And to this point, all of the states here in green have been digitized. And so that a person can go to the local family history center and ask for help on finding the digitized copies of the homestead records. You can go to Fold 3 or Ancestry. Fold 3, I haven't checked in the library to see if it's available on the library edition of Fold 3, but on the subscription, it's real easy to find. You just type in the name and what you're looking for, and it will pull up a film of all the different files that they have on there. And you do it by state. So you'd start off with Nebraska and then look for Louis Rivers, for example, and it would pull up the Rivers homesteads. And the same thing works for all of these other states. And again, when we look at these states down here, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, relatively few homesteads in that area. But when you get further west, Wyoming and Nebraska have a much higher number of homesteads. I expect that they will continue to work on it. They say they are, and eventually they will get those records out there. How long it will take, I don't know. But one of the things is that if you're not in a hurry to get these things, know that they are going to be digitized, and they have been working on digitizing them. And someday they will be available to use from your computer at home or at the library. If you can't wait, you can apply for them or order them through the National Archives. And you can do this is either by downloading and printing a form or actually doing it online and submitting it online. What they're going to want is as much information as possible. So if you can find proof of what property they homesteaded on the Bureau of Land Management patent records, so you have the legal description, you put that on there. I'm sure you'll get the records really quickly. If you can't find it there, but you know a legal description of the property, and you know for sure that they patented, that they actually were homesteaders, you can still fill out the application, put as much information as you can onto the form, and then send it in, and they will get back to you. Now, one thing about these records is they are not cheap right now. If you want records from, if you want records from the National Archives, this form says 40, but they've increased it to 50. I apologize. I was going to change that. I didn't. So to get the files, the complete homestead files now cost $50 from the National Archives. Generally, there's 15 to 25 pages. I'd want to say in the ballpark of 20, but I know I have several examples where there's less than 20 pages and a couple examples where there's more than 20 pages. So let's say ballpark figure of 20 pages of information. Anyway, you fill out the form, send it to them, or you fill out the form online and click send, and they will let you know if they find the record and charge you for the files. So there is an index for all the post 1908 land files for some states, not all states. Let's see. It gets a little confusing because there's land entry files for Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Louisiana, Nevada, and Utah. And you can find those on your form. But if you provide as much information as you can with the legal description of the property, the National Archives will find the information and send it to you. So That's how you would go about getting the form. And again, if you complete the form, the fee for the records are $50. And I have spent most of my time looking at successful claims in my family. There are examples in my family where people homesteaded and were not successful. The problem when you have someone who filed an unsuccessful claim, you don't have the legal description of the property. And so if you have someone in your family you know homesteaded but didn't complete the homestead, it's difficult to find that record, but that record exists. It may be only the application. You don't know how much of the process they went through. So what you want to do is you want to find out what you can to prove where the property was. So if you can find them in the Bureau of Land Management tract books, which are available through the LDS Church in many cases. In Wisconsin, they're at the State Historical Society. The problem is there's thousands of names in there and they're all arranged by the legal description of the property. So without knowing what the legal description of the property is, you're paging through all of the different legal descriptions to see if you recognize a name. It's a difficult thing to search. So far, they haven't been indexed. And the only way to do it is to go through page by page and try to find them. If you are going to make a request for this particular set of records or a set of records for land that was not successfully claimed, you need that legal description to ask for any record for a case that wasn't finished, that was rejected or canceled for any reason. So you have to go through the work. And I'm still going through pages and pages of North Dakota land tract books because I want to find a record for where my family went before 1920. They were not successful in homesteading in North Dakota. And the only place to find the legal description, because it's not recorded anywhere in the family records, is through these books. And it's just page by page looking. So anyway, that's kind of what's important to keep in mind about these things. There's a caveat about ordering records from the National Archives, especially right now with COVID. I don't know how many people they have in their building working, but they say that we're supposed to allow several months to ordering forms. They've been very good about getting things back to me in less than 2 months' time when I've ordered records. So anyway, what we talked about tonight was the kind of the Bureau of Land Management, the General Land Office databases, that they provide easy access to land descriptions for those who were successful. We also talked about the fact that you can get these records from the National Archives, and then depending on the state where you're looking, some of them are available through the Family History Center, Fold 3, or Ancestry. And we've also tried to demonstrate that some of the land entry records actually provide details about an ancestor's life that you're not going to find anyplace else. I see I spelled found wrong, I apologize. The story about my uncle Eugene, great uncle Eugene, moving onto the wrong property or clearing the wrong property when he first homesteaded. It's kind of a priceless story. And the only place that I've ever seen it is in his land entry files from the National Archives. And so with that, I'll stop, and if anyone has any questions, I will try to answer them. And oh wait, I should mention, this is actually, I think, Eugene Sweet's homestead. This was a picture taken in the 1970s. One of my third cousins actually owned the property at that time, and well, her father did. And they took 3 pictures of the home that my great-great-grandparents lived in, and they purchased, the home was purchased from the Sweet family. So I'm sure that's the original log home that belonged to Eugene and Mary Jane Spencer Sweet. And with that, I'll take questions.
My cat wasn't here until you said, okay, I'll start taking questions. And then she's like, oh, questions? Bethany's going to be turning on her camera again?
So I'm here.
Yes. So far we haven't had any during the talk itself.
Okay.
It was a very informational heavy program, specifically just focusing on how to access, and I haven't seen any questions on that. So we'll give everybody attending an opportunity to type in those questions. I'm half the time as I'm saying that, something will pop up because you guys are currently typing while I talk, but I'm going to take this opportunity to thank Don for putting together this presentation. It's a fantastic presentation. And for everybody that has joined us this evening, I hope you were able to take something away from this and will be able to utilize the information that Don was able to share with you for how to utilize, yes, I used that word twice, how to use the homesteading case files for your own research. All right, we do have a question from Carrie. Homesteading was only for farming. It seems so, but just checking to see if land home was only for farming purposes.
And actually, the different homesteading amendments, some of them were, there was one called the Timber Act. There was the Timber and Stone Act. There were different things that were added to the original Homestead Act based on location. So, for example, if you were in the West where they wanted to repopulate the forest, it was something about 40 acres of timber. If you maintain 40 acres of timber, you could get the homestead. There were different requirements put on, and it wasn't just specifically for farming. The thing with homesteading is there had to be some subsistence. You know, you had to be able to grow crops and things for yourself. And so there was kind of a requirement for agriculture, but it was also, there were other things there related to it. Louis Rivers raised hogs, for example, in Nebraska. If you go out west, there was a lot more grazing animals. So there might have been, that might have been what they were doing with the farmland or the land other than just grazing crops. I should mention, if somebody is interested in homestead records, I'm at the library on Tuesday mornings. I'll be glad to, you know, kind of show people where things are on Fold 3 or answer questions there also. So, or I can bring examples of some of the homestead records that I have, because I have quite a few.
I think you also did not mention Don, as he said, he's at the library. He's in the Felker Family History and Genealogy room, which is located on the second floor. It's pretty easy to spot once you walk up those stairs, but if you are trying to figure out where it is, you can ask at the adult information desk on the second floor and they will direct you to it as well. Carrie also has a follow-up question, wondering if there are any single women homesteaders that you might be aware of, Don.
Yes, I can't name any in my family, but when the Homestead Act was approved, it was not set up for just men. Women could apply for it. Sometimes married couples would apply for adjoining pieces of property, so that instead of having 160 acres, they'd have 320 acres. And so you may get married couples doing that. You also have women that are heads of household that were eligible to apply for homesteads and did. And then the other thing I didn't mention is African Americans. There was a large number of African Americans that applied for, I shouldn't say large number, there was a number of African Americans that applied for homestead land also. So what they stressed was the 21 years of age. It doesn't limit by sex. It doesn't limit by race or anything else. It was available to everyone.
All right, I haven't had any other questions come through yet. We'll give it just another moment here just in case, but I think we may have reached the end of our questions. Clearly, we have not ended the time that my cat wants to be the center of attention though.
Yeah.
All right, I haven't seen any other questions come through, so we are going to wrap up this program. Thank you to everybody one more time for joining us. I hope you have a great evening, and we hope we will see you at our next one. Thank you.
Oh, somebody just popped up a question.
Perfect timing.